Alright, so good evening everyone. Tonight we're going to kind of be talking about value and the value that people have. But first I want to share with you a little personal story from my own life. I've noticed that some people have a special gift. They're able to see the inherent value or potential in something that's totally messed up and broken and that other people would look at and be like, what? This is junk. My dad, for instance, he absolutely loves antique cars, and I used to be really into that too. But he's the kind of guy that'd be, driving along this little pickup truck. He's got one like me, except it doesn't have the big cap on the back. But he's got this little pickup truck driving along. He'll see this muscle car out in the weeds, and it's all rusty and covered in stuff. And some people probably wouldn't even know that it's a car. But my dad's like, that's a 1970 Dodge Challenger, and he'll be all super excited about it. He'll do like a double take. And sometimes he'll even stop and go in the person's yard and look at the car and stuff, and I've been with him when he does this. And I bet a lot of people probably wouldn't understand. They're probably going to think he's crazy. What's this guy doing, pulling off the side of the road to look at this rusty thing? But the thing is, my dad, he remembers these cars from when he was growing up. The big cars with the fins and, shiny and chrome and all that kind of stuff, and he remembers what they were. He remembers their value and the glory, that they had. And he sees these rust buckets as something of value, something with potential. And sometimes my dad just can't resist these cars, and they'll inevitably end up in our driveway, and you don't even want to know how many cars that we have. Most of them aren't currently running, but the dream is someday to restore them. So I've had the privilege of working with him on some of these cars. For my senior project in high school, we had to kind of do something big. So I decided, I want to restore a car. Little did I realize how much work that was going to be. So I got a 1968 Dodge Dart, and we started taking the brakes apart and taking the engine apart. And that's about as far as we got. I put the brakes back together, and the engine's still kind of apart. But I realized how much work it takes to bring this, and my car is in pretty good shape, but how much work it takes to bring a car that's all messed up back to its former glory. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of vision. You never know what kind of problems you're going to run into. It could be anything, People cover up dents with plastic filler, and you start scraping things off, and you realize it's a mess under there. So it could take hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars to finish up a car and do it right. But when you do, it's amazing. Sometimes the cars turn out better than they rolled out of the factory. Some people invest so much in them that they turn out to be absolutely beautiful, and they're fun to ride in. But it's really a labor of love and time-consuming and costly, but totally worth it. So that's what my dad sees when he sees this car sitting off in the weeds, covered in trees and rust and everything. Some people probably think, that's trash. That's ready for the crusher. Get that thing out of your yard. But my dad sees buried treasure. Totally different perspective. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today is perspective, but about people. So if you want to open up to Luke 15, that is going to be where we're starting today. Luke chapter 15 is the New Testament, which I'm sure all of you Bible scholars knew. Luke 15, we're going to take a look at God's perspective and the religious people's perspective on human value. And in this case, we're talking about the lost. Tax collectors and sinners. Are they rust buckets or buried treasure? We're going to find out. Starting in Luke 15. So as we read, just kind of ask God to examine your heart and ask Him to show you, what perspective are you bringing? And how does it line up with His perspective? So, if we start off in verse 1 of Luke 15, it says, Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near to listen to him. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable, saying, What man among you, if he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture and go after the one which was lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. He's carrying this sheep around and throwing a party. And that's not in scriptures. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost." And I tell you, in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. So, this is a very common story that's used, and there's a lot of different places you can go with it. But today, I want you to see the two different perspectives that are being held. We have the Pharisees and the scribes, and then we have that of Jesus. And these two different perspectives are worlds apart. Okay? The Pharisees and the scribes are shocked that Jesus is hanging out with this crowd. They're the irreligious Jews and the tax collectors, unclean, stay away. So the religious society was like, don't associate with these guys. These religious people see trash. They see that rusty car sitting in the weeds, just take it to the crusher, don't worry about it. Get rid of that thing. But Jesus, he sees things differently. He's seeing things from his Father's perspective. So to him, he sees these people as lost sheep. And these sheep, they belong to the shepherd. And even though they've strayed, they need to be returned and restored to the flock. They have value to that shepherd. And they're so valuable, in fact, that they're worth throwing a heavenly party over. That's amazing. So where the religious people saw trash, Jesus sees treasure. It's all a matter of perspective, right? So the question is, what do we see when we look out at the world? Do we see trash or do we see treasure? And so it's important to discover our perspective and how we view and value people. Because what I've learned is how we value people determines how we're going to treat them.
That's right.
And this is something that God's been working on in my life lately, so that's kind of why I wanted to share it with you guys. I was asked to teach a Sunday school class for little 6th to 8th graders a couple weeks ago. And it got me thinking, what are these kids going through? It brought me back to my high school days. And I was thinking about the complex social structure of a school. So you see that people's value is based on just a variety of different things, all of which are temporary and really not what you want to pin somebody's value on. But if you think about it, if you look at a high school, you have at the top of the pyramid, you have kind of like generally the wealthy kids, you have the cheerleaders, you have the people that are like super smart, you have the people that are attractive, you have the people that, know how to dress right, which was never me, and the super athletic people, right? And they're like the top of the top. And then you have the people at the bottom, and I was told the other day that there's a difference between nerds and geeks. So anyways, you get the nerds and the geeks, and they're typically like at the bottom of the totem pole there, right? And then you got the people that are labeled as slow, which is not a good way to label people, but people do it. And then you got the kids that like don't have a lot of money, and people look down on them, right? And then the kids that have no friends, that was probably kind of me in high school. The kids that have handicaps, the kids that are on drugs, sometimes the people that are of a different race or color. And these people all tend to kind of be down towards the bottom. Maybe some of us were there, maybe some of us were way up there. But what I want you to recognize about this system is, and it's common in all of society, it's not just high school, is that it teaches people that their value is based on their appearance, how much they have, their intelligence, maybe even their usefulness, all these different things, their physical ability. And so those people who are at the top of the pyramid, they think that their value is found in these things. And because of that, they look down on people that don't have these things. Because of how they define human worth, they see trash. And when we see a person as trash, it causes us to treat them that way, right? But when we see a person as treasure, it changes the way that we treat them. And that's what God's been challenging with me in my life. We're going to take a look at Matthew 10:29 to 31. And we're going to try to see a little bit more into how did Jesus see people? Because he had his Father's perspective. He saw people through God's eyes. So go to Matthew 10, verse 29 to 31. It comes right after the section on all the incredible miracles that Jesus did and prepared his disciples to preach the gospel. So Matthew 10, verses 29 to 31. In the context of this passage on evangelism, and we'll actually get a little more into that. But in verse 29 it says, actually if you go back to verse 28, he's warning his disciples. He's saying, don't fear those who can kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, rather. Fear him who's able to destroy both the soul and the body in hell. And he's comforting them here and assuring them of their value. In verse 29 he says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Can you imagine that? This is kind of silly, but I've always been like, God, I want a graph of the number of hairs that I've had throughout my entire life, when I see you in the kingdom. Kind of silly, but, you get the point. God knows everything about us. He's aware of all of us. We're valuable to him. He says in verse 31, so do not fear. You're more valuable than many sparrows. The life of God's people, they're valuable to him. So much so that he knows the number of hairs in their heads. That's just cool. So, I'm sure that Jesus knew about God's perspective on human value based on his knowledge of the scriptures and what he'd learned in synagogue and all of that. He must have known that mankind was created in the image of God. We see that in Genesis 1:26 to 28. It says he was created in the image of God and placed over all of creation. Appointed as the caretakers of this world. That's incredible. That's incredible value right there. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that he knew that we're God's handiwork, right? We're in Psalm 139, it says that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. It talks about how we're hand-formed by God. Kind of a little metaphorical there, but you get the picture. We're known by God even before we're born. And, he must have known, even as fallen and as sinful as we are, that we're so valuable to God that God desires us to repent and turn back to him. I was reading in Ezekiel this morning, or the other day, that it says that God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked and desires that the wicked turn from their ways and live. That's amazing. Even the wicked, he doesn't want them to perish. They're valuable to him. So Jesus knew that people were so valuable to God, and he was willing to give up his life for them. He saw the value, and it changed the way that he lived. So how Jesus saw people impacted how he responded to them, right? We're getting that? If you want to look over a little bit in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, this is one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. Matthew 9:36. It says that seeing the people, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited, like sheep without a shepherd. There's that metaphor again. He's calling the people sheep and identifying them as in need of a shepherd there. But he's feeling compassion. Jesus saw these people that he knew that God valued, and they're distressed and they're dispirited. And another translation says harassed and hurting or helpless. And Jesus felt compassion, and he was moved to action. So let's read on a little bit and see how he responded to that. In verse 37, it says that he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. And down in chapter 10, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. We're going to skip down to verse 5 real quick, too. And these 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter into any city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you have received, and freely give. So Jesus saw these people, and his heart was aching. He saw buried treasure. He saw things from God's perspective. God's treasure buried under the weight of sin. And so how did he respond to that? He told his disciples to pray and to ask God to send out more laborers into the harvest. And you know what he did? He sent them out into the harvest to preach the good news to the lost sheep. That was his solution. So how we see the people impacts how we're going to respond to them. Jesus saw these people that could be restored, restored back to what God created them to be. He saw the value. And so how we see people impacts how we're going to respond. So how do we determine a person's value? Do we have the same perspective as the Pharisees and judge by outside appearances? And, they're probably valid judgments in those cases. But do we see people the way that Jesus and his Father do and recognize their inherent value to God? They're people created in God's very image. So this is something, as I've said, that's been challenging me lately, and God's been helping me to see that my perspective on human value does not always line up with his perspective. Sometimes, I'll judge people because of what they look like on the outside, or maybe I'll judge them by their intelligence, or, their lifestyle choices, all these things. I think we do this all the time. Sometimes we don't even recognize it anymore. Maybe some of us struggle with judging people based on their race or their economic status or political affiliation. I've seen that a lot. We bash the liberals or the conservatives or, whatever it might be because of their particular affiliation, and that's not right. Maybe we're looking down on somebody because of their lack of ability to perform in a certain area. That's not good either. God knows our hearts, knows my heart, your heart. And he wants to help us to see people from his perspective. Mm-hmm. He wants to heal this hurt that we have inside of us and help us to see the world the way that he does. So what I've kind of learned is that oftentimes pride can be a really good indicator of what we're basing people's value on. For instance, if I was to find myself elevating myself like, oh man, I preached a super good sermon, and I start looking down on somebody if they didn't preach a good sermon. Well, it looks like I'm determining my value based on how well I performed. And because of that, I'm looking down on that other person. And really, pride is just a sign of insecurity. What it shows is that we've lost sight of our inherent value. And we're trying to find our value in something else. It means we're trying to find our value in how much money we make, or what we wear, or the color that we are, or, maybe the social status that we have. All these things, when we're feeling prideful about it, it just shows we're insecure and we've lost sight of who we are. And so what we really need is a change of perspective, right? We saw the Pharisees, and we see Jesus, and they're worlds apart. We need to see what's God's perspective, and we need to internalize that, because that's the only way we're going to respond to people in a Christ-like manner. Jesus was only able to respond with compassion because he saw the people the way God did. And so I want to leave you guys with some practical applications. If you want to turn to Romans 12, that's going to be where we start. Helpful if I could find it too. Somewhere near the back of the Bible, Romans 12. Right after Acts, 4, 1 Corinthians. Okay. So we really need to start with prayer first. But we're going to take a look at Romans 12:1. We're going to end up in verse 3. And Paul says here, "Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed," changed, "by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but think as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." So, Paul is saying that we need to renew our minds, and the way that we do that is by soaking in God's word, by getting his perspective on these things, because otherwise we see things from our point of view, and we don't even know there's another point of view out there. We always think our way is the right way, and generally that's not true. Jesus usually saw things from a completely different standpoint than we do. So what we also see here is not only that our minds need to be transformed to think the way God does, but also that we're supposed to have sober judgment about ourselves. This means we're not supposed to puff ourselves up with pride, but we're not also supposed to squish ourselves down with false humility either. We're supposed to recognize that, we've been created by God and we have value simply because we belong to Him. We're all created in His image and dearly loved. So we need to adopt that attitude of humility and recognize that. We're going to take a jump down to verse 10, or up in my case, in my Bible, 12:10. It says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor." So, oftentimes, we kind of think of ourselves as the center of the world. I know I struggle with this sometimes. But Paul is saying we need to give preference to one another in honor. One thing I've been kind of thinking about is, if we're all created in God's image and valuable to Him, all equally valuable, when you're in the presence of another person, it's a privilege, it's an honor. That is someone that God made. That is someone that God loves. What if we were to adopt that perspective when we interact with the cashier at Walmart, when we interact with our fellow students, when we see that homeless guy on the side of the road? That person was created by God. That person was made in His image. Jesus died for that person. What if we had that perspective? How would that change the way that we act? I want to look at Philippians 2:3-4, and this is kind of the last point here. It kind of clarifies a little bit what we've been talking about, the attitude that we want to adopt. That's what I'm trying to clarify here, this attitude of humility, of honoring the other person above yourself. That's what Jesus did for us. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, not too far away from Romans. New Testament's kind of small comparatively. So Philippians 2, 3 and 4. This is another one of my favorite passages, talking about adopting the same attitude as Christ. In verse 3, it says that we're to do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. With humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Don't merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Wow. That verse always gets me. We're not supposed to just look out for ourselves, for number one. That's what the world teaches us. That's what society teaches us. Me, me-centric world. But God is saying that we need to look out for the needs of others, and that we're to regard them with an attitude of humility as more important than ourselves. And this is a matter of perspective, right? That's what we've been talking about. So when we do that, we're going to honor these people. So that's kind of what I want to close with. I can't give you all the specifics on how to live that out. You'll find that in here. It'd be a really long sermon otherwise, and I don't want to do that to you. So if you just ask God to change your heart and to renew your mind, He's going to do that. He wants to do that, He's all about changing us to make us more like Him, so that we'll glorify Him, right? So He wants to renew our minds and give us a biblical perspective on human value, because the world simply doesn't have that. He'll do it. And I guarantee that as He begins to change you, what you thought was trash, you're going to see is really buried treasure. You're going to have a greater desire to love and serve others, because you're going to see that there is something beautiful that God has placed in them, the person that God has created them to be. And you're going to want to draw that out from the weight of that sin and the habits and everything else that clouds that person and prevents them from being all that God created them to be. So ask God to change your heart, adopt that attitude of humility, look out for one another as more important than yourselves, and just watch God do amazing things in your life. So that is the end.